Here's the second part of that. If you watch that first part on shaping the spectral content of your summed mix, here's just an example. It's not a very finite example, but this can really make your mix, because the problem is, let's say you got a violin, right? Okay, you've got this violin on the track, and you've spent a whole bunch of time sculpting it to where it sounds great, right? Now, that violin sounds awesome. It just sounds perfect, dude. You've sculpted on it. It sounded good to begin with, and you are just such a picky person. It sounds awesome. There is not another violin on the whole planet that sounds any better than that. I mean, it's just that badass, right? Okay. Now, you spend all that time on those individual tracks. Now you're summing, right? So you've got the tracks together, and, when you start mixing it and you've got the whole orchestra mixed in there, that all of a sudden that you're looking around at some of the spectral content, that the mix is having some issues in some areas. So one thing I want to address is sometimes this is a really good spot to do automation with your EQ and really learn how to automate with your EQ between sections, okay? Because when you set an EQ on the track and you're just going to set it for the whole track, sometimes, especially in orchestral or in lots of types of music, or at breaks or at choruses or whatever, that the spectral content is going to change. The whole form, the whole layout of the spectral content across the spectrum is going to look different. And so you might need to do some different EQ. So you have done some automation out of one section, and then you've done some EQ work on the next section, but you've made them you have set some automation so that you can do some different EQing on those sections. You've got the first section, and it sounds great with all your EQs sound like that. It goes to the next section. The harmonic content in that section needs to be addressed as almost as a different song. And I know that might sound nitpicky beyond comprehension, but that can make or break a song, that you got this drum break that's got a little bit of bass or a trumpet behind it, or or an orchestra break, or some type of specific genre of music that does some kind of change, and you have to approach that as it's almost a different song. So the automation, when you're thinking about this, doing it from one section to another, is very important to keep that in mind and really consider that, because that can make your whole song. You'd be going along, and that'll take it from, you did a lot of EQ work on it, and doing it from different section can take it to a whole new level. Now, this right here is a prime example of something I'm talking about. Now, this can be very specific, but if you're going along and you've got this part, and it's like, well, now you've looped this section or the song, if you're really not going to spend that much time on it, either way. And you've gone back through and if you watch the other video, you've gone back and hit those sends on the other instruments to see a comparison of the spectrum of the spectral content as comparison to the mix. Now you come to some parts where it's like, this part right here needs to be attenuated. For some reason, it's just loud in this section or in the song in general. And you're going, well, what am I do there? And you go back and you find some instruments that might be real loud in that area, and that spectral content in that area is really boosting that up to where it doesn't sound right. The full spectrum content of the song doesn't sound right. So you go back to those instruments and you take your EQ and you start attenuating in those areas. And you're doing some really finite spectral work on the sum of your mix and the harmonic content, because if you watch those other videos, that basically that this upper mix is basically a distorted sinusoid, the way that the studio sees it and the way formatting sees it. So you're having to do some work in the spectral content of basically that distorted sinusoid, which I don't want to get too much into that, but basically what it works out to. So by doing this kind of stuff, you're actually changing the sinusoid of your mix. Does that make sense? But the thing is to remember, as you go back and you find those tracks, and you might find one track that's a little bit high, so you boost it down a little bit, and you find another track that's doing a little bit of the same thing, and so you try to attenuate that one just a little bit also. And I know that sounds like a lot of work, but that can just make it, because the problem is you're dealing with timbres, so you can't, if you just start hammering on it on the main part of the mix, you're not really fine-tuning the spectral content as far as the mix of those instruments and those timbres, because you're affecting those frequencies as a summed mix rather than the individual instruments. which it is a different approach. And then also, let's say you got up on the high end. Well, this one instrument here has got some real nice high-end stuff. I mean, way up in the upper registries that if you're looking at your main mix and it's missing some of that up in this area here or wherever, you know, that it might be that it looks like it's just lacking. And so you go back and find, you know, where you might be able to boost that some to try to get some of that sound, find an instrument that's really, that has some spectral content in those areas. And you start seeing if you can boost that. You know, you're right in there, you're like, I'm going to try to boost that up in there some. And then see what it sounds like in the some mix. Because here's the whole thing is because if you go back and mess around, this is something that really takes time to work on. It's just not something that I can just sit here in a video or two. If I made a 3-hour video, you'd find you'd probably get bored, and you'd really just need to go start using it. You know, take a mix or a practice mix and really spend time learning how to use this technique to shape the spectral content of the sum of your mix. Because now you've taken this beautiful violin that you had and you've warped the shit out of it, right? Well, as far as you think, you know, you're like, well, I spent all that time, you go back and solo and you're like, it sounds like crap now. You know, it doesn't sound anything I want to. Well, that's not the point. That violin by itself, that it's by itself and you've sculpted it beautifully. But when you're mixing, now you're not trying to make just that beautiful violin. You're trying to make that violin become part of the spectral content of the mix, and you might have to change the spectral content and the EQing of it to make it more complementary to the mix and to help the whole mix. Does that make sense? That's a huge point to remember and a huge point to get into your head to work on. Because you go back and it's like now you've taken this and you got, well, I boosted the EQ up here in this register way up, dude. And it's like, well, in my main mix, it added something, dude. And it was like, and it really did it. It needed that spectral content up in that higher end or right around these frequencies here. And that instrument had it to boost. So I used that instrument, tried to boost it up in that area or for that section. And it filled it out awesome, dude. It did a great job. And then you go back and listen to that instrument solo, and you're like, well, it doesn't really sound nowhere near as good as if I had it all mixed for itself and all EQ'd it and sound sculpted it and spent all that time on it. It was badass. Now I've just screwed the whole damn thing up. It really doesn't sound that good by itself. But the point is you're not, it's a tool, it's a part of the frequency content of this. You have to stop looking at it as its individual instrument and looking at it as it's another timbre to be added to this timbre to fill out this timbre. Does that make sense? Because basically that's all this works out to is a timbre from one note to the next, that right when it hits right there, that's a timbre being formed. I know that is a little drastic representation, but basically that's what it works out to. You got a main vocalist and he hits ah, and the rest of the band's behind him, and it actually forms a timbre at that moment in the spectral content, just like the timbre of that violin has a spectral content. And it's the same concept. There's no difference in it. It's hard to try to see it that way, and some people won't teach it that way, but it really is. And so you go back and start doing this kind of stuff on some of the other tracks, or you got this area here, and for some reason it just doesn't sound right, and so you go back to other tracks and go find some instrument that has some content there that you can try to boost some, try to bring up a little bit to fill in that area, and listen, see what it's doing to the whole mix at that point. And it can be a huge tool. Sometimes you go back, and there's been times where I'll go back and I'll listen to that horn that I spent a whole bunch of time sculpting, because I'm a nitpicky bastard sometimes. And I'd be like, oh dude, that horn is so cool. And then I start doing this, and I start spectral shaping, you know, for the whole mix, and I go back, and then I try to solo that horn myself, and I'll go, oh dude, that does not sound good, dude. But for that combination of instruments, for the timbre that was happening right there, it did sound good. And sometimes it's not that much, and sometimes you can't do that much because you change that trumpet sound so much to where it don't even sound like a trumpet anymore, that it might really color the track or the entire mix to where it doesn't sound the way it should. So a lot of times the way just to approach that is a little bit at a time and really listen to it and A-B it back and forth, you know, try to set up another bus or something to where you got an A-B and go back and listen to them and see what's happening there. And I know that sounds like a lot of time consuming, and it's not just pushing a fader here and there, but that kind of stuff can give you a mix, and the final product can be a mix that's going to, that's going to make it, dude, that's going to push your mix over the edge. Does that make sense? But I hope I made that pretty clear and that you understood what that meant, so that when you're going around through that you are doing that with different instruments. You're going back on the sends, if you watched the previous video, that, you're going back to those other sends and you've got an EQ on all of them, on all those buses or on all those instruments, and then you go back and start trying to shape them a little bit differently to make that them are trying to shape this harmonic content rather than you so much worried about what their harmonic content is. Just be real careful that you don't warp that instrument so bad that it's not doing any good to this harmonic content, because it don't even sound like a horn anymore or something like that. Does that make sense? You got to be real careful of that. But sometimes, you get in there and you boost up that frequency on that one instrument just a little bit while it's in that mix, and that did it, dude. That did it. Rather than try to address it from here, and then you try to approach it from there, and then when you get done doing all that, and you've shaped that spectral content from the individual tracks going through them and really paying attention to that, then if you've got some other work a little bit at the end. Now, this is one ICP EQ, and there's like one little EQ, and it's got just a little teeny notch right there, and that's all they did to it. And it's like, well, it's like, that is the place for that. Does that make sense? Because you've done all this work that we've talked about. If you watched all the videos I've put on here, and I know they're not Hollywood, but they're pretty specific, most of them, that you've done some pretty good, spectral shaping. And, that might be it, dude. At the end of your mix, and you're going to do EQ for the mix, you just went like that, dude. And that was it. It's done, dude. Does that make sense? Because you spent all that time working on it, from where you should have worked on it, rather than trying to fix it all at the end. And just remember, bashing on this at the end of the mix rather than going back, that's like, so a lot of times I can just be like bashing it with a hammer rather than going back with a real fine chisel, and really sculpting the sound of this some mix. And I certainly hope that made sense. And if you watched the previous video and this video, that I didn't really give you a whole lot of super, definitive areas and genres or applications, but for every mix. Does that make sense? And to look at it that way and just try it. And you'll be surprised that at the end, if you do it that way, a lot of times at the end of the mix, when you're starting to do the end, you're dropping that one down a little bit there, and this one right here, you pushed up just a little teeny bit right there. And that was it, dude. It's done, It's like, does that make sense? Because you've done a really good job of shaping the spectral content of that mix and really approached it as, carving it and shaping it like a fine piece of, a fine carving. Does that make sense? So I hope that helped a lot, and you can ping me and ask me a question if you want about that, but I hope that made that pretty self-explanatory, and that is definitely a technique that you have to work on. It's not something you're going to have to get mixes and mess with it and see what it does, and remember all the things that I said here, and you might run into mixes where, like I said, that you have to EQ in sections and use automation. I mean, really look at each section almost like an individual song. You want to keep the basic, in certain songs and a lot of songs, the basic, content, the spectral content, but it can change, when harmonies kick in, or a brass section, or, just a drum and the bass, or something else is going on, that you need to start trying to fill out, address those tracks together individually like this, to try to make this spectral content as full as possible, and get out your phase meter, and see if you've got good stereo field, what's going on. Has it got a good stereo sound? Look at those things. So I hope that helped a lot, and I know that is a huge tool. I mean, that is a huge tool. And sometimes, that can be time consuming, but it can really make your mix. So I hope that helped a lot, and peace, hope, love.